The Department of Social Development says it will appeal a decision by the High Court in Pretoria relating to the disbursement of the Social Relief of Distress grant. The challenge was brought by the Institute of Economic Justice. Let's unpack this further. We're joined now with Siyanda Baduza, who is a basic income grant researcher at the IEJ. Siyanda, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. Perhaps you can begin by, or perhaps we can begin by reflecting on what the judge in that ruling last week had to say. It found the Social Development Department and SASSA to be oblivious to human suffering and the lack of dignity caused by bureaucracy. What do you make of this decision to appeal, just based on those strong words?
I think the judge definitely did feel for the plight of grant recipients for sure. And of course, probably led to why he essentially agreed with us on everything that we were calling for, which we definitely do agree that a lot of the stance that was taken by the state is definitely one that didn't really consider the conditions that grant recipients are living under. So for example, even when we were filing, we had 75 affidavits that dealt and very in detail described the lived experiences of grant recipients and how they were suffering under the conditions and of these regulations, and the state didn't really respond to that. So an appeal definitely is disappointing, because we would have hoped that the department would have complied with the court and moved to start implementing a lot of and removing a lot of the regulations that were deemed unconstitutional and unlawful. And an appeal will only really serve to extend the suffering and extend the prejudice of a lot of these recipients.
Just to be clear, the department has said that the Social Relief of Distress grant will continue, that services will continue and will be uninterrupted while this appeal process is ongoing.
Well, yes, the grant will continue, but it will continue in its current form, so in the form that was being challenged. Yeah, so for example, things like the income verification, the online only applications were things that the judge deemed to be unconstitutional and unlawful. So had they not been appealing, those would have had to be struck down, and the department would have had to create a new solution to that. So while it does continue, it unfortunately continues in the state that prejudices a lot of people who are the ones receiving the grant and also those who should be qualifying.
Right. My apologies. My question did focus on the fact that the grant will still be paid in its current form. But Siyanda, give us more clarity on the kinds of things that will now be in place, the changes that will be put in place. You talked about the online application system, proof of residence. What other issues now remain in place while the department appeals this ruling?
So I think that the whole system will continue in place as is. We're seeking legal advice on ways and if it is possible to get some of the regulations implemented. But for example, things like the definition of income, which the state refused to provide a definition for, which the court moved to provide a definition, because we know before it was that they were considering, say, any inflow into someone's bank account as income. So things like child maintenance payments received by one parent on behalf of a child were basis for someone to be excluded. Even donations were basis for exclusion. So the court had moved to provide a definition that says income, for example, is just formal, informal employment or business activities, or financial support is something that someone is entitled to receive. Well, those will unfortunately continue in the old definition, where the department will still consider all those to be inflows. Things like the bank verification method, which was considered a blunt and inhumane instrument because it doesn't allow for any contextualization of inflows into someone's bank account, and was deemed unconstitutional, will unfortunately also continue in its form. Another measure was that the judge had ordered that the value be evaluated, but if they're appealing and if that doesn't stand, I guess it continues at the 370 that it is currently.
It's a massive blow for social grant recipients. And I know we talk about this all the time. We are among the most unequal countries in the world. And the truth of it is that the social relief of distress grant, even though to some people it might seem like very little money, to others and to many people, it is a lifeline.
Absolutely, like for many people, and I think the department's own estimates put it at around 18.3 million people in South Africa who live under 624 rands. It is the only source of like income that they can rely on a monthly basis, the only lifeline that they have. And even though it's tiny because it's nowhere near, say, the 795 like extreme poverty line that's set by Stats SA, it's at least some form of income that they can use in order to sustain themselves for at least a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. As the Institute for Economic Justice, going back to court now to face this appeal, does the Institute feel confident that the basis on which it argued initially and the basis on which the court found initially will still stand?
I think we are pretty confident because I think we provided a very strong case. There was a lot of evidence that was backing a lot of the arguments that we were making. So, for example, things like the value and means test threshold, we were using like objective definitions of income and objective measures of poverty, which are released by Stats SA. We were arguing on the basis of like expert estimates on what, say, the number of people receiving the grant should be, whereas a lot of what the state was doing was a lot of the numbers especially were very arbitrary. So for example, like even in how much they decide to allocate budget-wise to the grant, that wasn't based in any assessment of how many people should actually be qualifying. We even had those affidavits that very clearly detailed people's experiences. So we're pretty confident. It is still disappointing though, because it means that it just delays the justice to beneficiaries. But as far as arguing the case, I think we had a very strong case and we're still very confident in what we argued.
Yeah, it's a big week for the president this week, Siyanda, the State of the Nation coming up, State of the Nation address coming up on Thursday. We talk about this again. It's sort of an annual conversation we have about the kinds of poverty alleviation measures that we need to hear from the president. But what's your take on that?
So for the last couple sonas, what the president has stated to be government policy, especially when it relates to this SRD grant, has been that they intend to keep it permanent and to extend it like as a form of like permanent basic income moving forward and then extend it. Unfortunately, of course, we know that that hasn't really been implemented. And even in the court papers, the state was arguing that they shouldn't be held to say what the president says at the SONA. But last couple SONAs, there's been that commitment. So what we're hoping for is that, of course, that the president does again reiterate what the state's position is on the SRD grant, which we understand to be that it is supposed to be permanent and expanded. But also, and I think we'll also be paying attention to the budget speech because there's been a big contradiction between what the government argues and what National Treasury decides to budget for. So we're in a situation now, unfortunately, where the president and the Minister of Social Development will argue that like the SRD grant is here to stay and that it's important. But for example, in the medium-term budget statement that was released in September last year, there wasn't any explicit provision for the SRD grant. It's only after we inquired with Treasury on what that progress was, and they said that there was some like obscure allocation that was made under infrastructure, I think, and other spending. So we're hoping, of course, to hear about what their plan is for the grant moving forward. Because I think when it comes to like poverty alleviation strategies, I think there isn't a more efficient way to alleviate poverty than directly giving money to people, because they can then decide how they want to allocate that spending. It's a way for people to directly deal with the constraints they face instead of like the state prescribing how they should be going about that.
No, absolutely. Siyanda Baduza, thanks very much indeed for your time this afternoon. The Basic Income Grant Researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. And of course, this is one of the important conversations we're having, particularly as we build up to the State of the Nation address on Thursday.